very symmetrically, which means, in effect, that black's just playing for a draw. Let's say white now takes the pawn, knight takes e5, and black plays d6. Get out of there. Well, suppose you now blunder and play bishop to b5 check. Black can block that check too, and suddenly two white pieces are under fire. The knight at e5 and the bishop at b5. So very often you want to not answer a threat by giving a threat of your own, because if your opponent can defend against your threat with an additional threat, you'll be facing two threats, and that may be impossible to handle. One more thing, another big time waster. Don't exchange a developed piece for an undeveloped one. For example, this bishop on f4 has just been developed there, and black castled. It would be a real mistake to grab the knight on b8. That knight was doing nothing. Its potential had not been built up. Black just takes it back, and white has expended a couple of tempi for nothing. He's developed a piece and then exchanged it off. In other words, he's expended two moves and gotten nothing for it because his bishop's not in the game any longer. In the opening of a chess game, don't waste time. Don't move the same piece repeatedly. Don't give pointless checks. And don't exchange developed pieces for undeveloped ones. One of the biggest drains of time in the early part of the game is moving the queen out early. Every time you bring it out, it can be attacked, and you'll have to waste time moving it to safety. Let's see what happens if you try to bring it out and keep it in the center of the board. e4, d5, takes, queen takes it back, and now it's subject to attack. White can play knight to c3. If we try to keep it in the center with queen to d4, white can attack it again. And let's say we keep it close to the center, queen c5. We'll hit it once more, d5, and if we fall for this one and play queen to c6, bishop b5 snares it with a pin. Of course, this is a worst case scenario, so to speak, and you're not going to bring the queen out and allow it to be attacked. I just wanted to illustrate some of the problems. Let's look at a more realistic example. Let's say we start e4, e5, and then break quickly with the center game, d4. E takes d4. Now if the queen takes it back, black can start to gain the initiative by attacking the white queen. He can play knight to c6, and suddenly white is responding to black's moves. White will have to get his queen to safety. Curiously, we can play almost the same moves, and it won't be so bad. For example, let's say white begins e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and now we break with d4, the Scotch game. Let's say black exchanges, e takes d4, knight takes d4 for white, and now if black should take the white knight, that brings the white queen to the center. Queen takes d4. Is the queen placed badly here? Well, no, it isn't, because you see, we can't play knight on b8 to c6 because the knight on b8 doesn't exist. We've traded it already. And therefore, what this means is that the queen can really stay in the center. The only way that black can attack it is by playing c5, and that's not a very valuable attack. It doesn't contribute to black's development. It even weakens squares. It abandons control of d6, no longer is that guarded by a pawn, and d5. And after white retreats the queen to safety, black's stuck with these permanent holes. So there are times when you might want to bring your queen to the center if it's a natural move and you're doing it as a response to something that your opponent has forced or allowed. One of the worst things you can do with your queen is to go pawn grabbing. That is, you bring the queen out, you see the possibility of taking an undefended pawn, and you have to waste time bringing the queen back into civilization. Let me give you an example. e4, c6, the Caro-Kann defense, d4, d5, and let's say we trade pawns, e takes, c takes back, and now c4. Let's say black defends the pawn and develops a knight, knight to f6, and white develops a knight in turn himself. Black continues development, now with two knights out, and white plays bishop to g5. Probably best for black is e6, solidifying the center and creating an open diagonal for the king bishop. But black doesn't play that, let's say, and plays queen to b6 instead. He's going pawn grabbing. He's going to grab this poison pawn down here. Let's see if he can get away with it. C takes d5, hitting black's knight. And now this is a possibility because the black queen has been removed from the center and is no longer guarding d5. Let's say black takes it off on b2, hitting the knight. White stops to defend that knight with a useful developing move. Rook to c1, and now black's knight on c6 must move. Now how does black salvage that knight? Does he play knight to a5, or does that allow queen to a4 check, fork, double attack, hitting the king and the knight? No good. Can black instead play knight to b8, retreating the knight to the back rank where it started? Can't do that either because knight a4 attacks the black queen while unveiling a discovered attack to the bishop at c8. That's a problem. What black wound up doing is playing knight to b4. Notice the black queen and knight. White played knight to a4, attacking the queen. The black queen cannot retreat. The knight's in the way. It really doesn't have any way to go to. It took the pawn, a2, pawn grabbing further, and now white played bishop to c4. Okay, what does black's queen do? We can't take the bishop. We really don't have any place to go to. Perhaps our last refuge is a3. If we go there, however, rook to c3 traps the queen and forces black to jettison this knight so that the queen will have an escape. He'll have to play knight to d3 check or c2, giving the queen a clear retreating diagonal. Instead, black plays some kind of counterattack. He plays bishop to g4, hoping for one last mistake, one last hope. If white plays f3, his queen can scurry across the board to g2 and escape. In fact, he'll win a rook. But white doesn't fall for that. He plays knight to f3. And after bishop takes f3, g takes f3, the queen would have to play to a3, and rook to c3 would force the sacrifice of the black knight. So the early movement of black's queen, the pawn-grabbing attempt, has cost black a piece. You can waste time grabbing pawns in other ways. Consider this position out of the queen's gambit. d4, d5, c4, offering the queen bishop pawn. The real idea behind this, which is the queen's gambit, is to lure this pawn out of the center so that at some point white can play this move, creating a classical pawn center. Let's say this does happen and black takes the pawn. The best way for white to continue now is to play knight to f3, discouraging a counter-sacrifice to open up the d-file, leading to the trade of queens. Let's say instead, though, you go right for your pawn to try to get it back, and you play e3. And let's say black becomes very materialistic and tries to protect his pawn. And white follows with a4, attempting to undermine the whole thing. Of course, you cannot follow with a6 because we will take the pawn on b5, and notice that the pin rook to rook prevents a takes b5. But let's say you try to keep your pawns intact and play c6. That's just too costly. White takes it off, black takes it back. Black has made only pawn moves at this point. All his pieces are still residing on the back rank, and it's going to cost him. You see this line? Here, instead of the queen going pawn grabbing, we've used it to punish the other side for the offense of pawn grabbing. How does black save his rook? The only way he can do so is by giving up a piece, by putting it in the way and throwing it away. He could play knight to c6, and white would take that with check. And I guess black would save his rook this way, but still, after white gets his queen to safety, he's won a piece. So you really shouldn't go pawn grabbing under any circumstances. One last example, a more subtle one, from the Queen's Gambit as well, involving a pin. And pins are very tricky and illusory. You think you have something and you don't. Consider this: d4, d5, c4, e6. Now knight to c3, pressuring the black d-pawn. Knight to f6, upholding it. And let's say white plays bishop to g5, an early pin. It's an okay move here. And now black plays knight b to d7. I ask you, how many times is this pawn guarded? We see there's a pawn on e6 protecting it, and possibly the knight on f6, except that doesn't the bishop pin it and prevent its movement? Don't forget, this is a relative pin. That is, behind the knight is the queen. And that means if black's willing to accept the consequences, perhaps he could move it. White didn't consider that and played c takes d5. Black took it back. And here we go again, pawn grabbing, albeit in the center of the board, and black is losing a valuable pawn, it seems. Not quite, because white has neglected his development. Knight takes d5, giving up the queen. What's this? Bishop takes d8. Has black missed something? It's the other way around. It's white who's missed something. Bishop to b4, check. How do you get out of check? Only one way: you have to place your queen in line and give it up. Black knew he was getting the queen back. After bishop takes d2 check, king takes d2, and with black's next move, he wins a piece. The bishop that took the black queen to begin with. Here was a case of white neglecting development so that he had nothing to do when the check came but to put his own queen in the way. So try not to move your queen early in the game. It wastes time. And in particular, avoid grabbing pawns, moving your queen out of place, wasting time bringing it back, and only allowing yourself to be set up for traps. After moving your center pawns and getting out a few minor pieces, you're going to want to castle. Then you'll be ready for business. You don't want to start attacking, really, before you've gotten your king to a safe position. If you do so, you may be subject to a powerful counterattack. For example, let's say e4, e5, f4, the King's Gambit. White's trying to lure the black king pawn out of the center so that at some suitable point, white can follow with d4. Let's say black takes the pawn. Black now has the possibility of a check at h4 with his queen, so white guards against that, knight to f3. And let's say black tries to protect his f-pawn and plays g5. And white develops bishop to c4. And black follows f6, protecting the g5 pawn. What a weakening move that is. It opens up the bishop's diagonal so that black couldn't castle if he wanted to. And notice that this line is open as well. If only the white queen could occupy it. That's a cue. Knight takes g5, f takes g5, and it's almost all over. Queen h5 check. Only move, king e7. And then we invade to the 7th rank, queen f7. The king has but one square to go to, d6, and after queen d5, king e7, it's mate in one move. White can play queen e5. Nowhere for the black king to go. It's all over. But look, black has developed nothing. He's moved the pawns on the king side to protect the f4 pawn. He began operations before he was ready. At our next example, we see this in a more subtle fashion. White plays e4. Black responds with the Caro-Kann defense, c6. White plays d4. Black plays d5. Now, I should add at this point that this is one of the fastest games, one of the shortest games ever played between two grandmasters, Reti and Tartakova. Reti had white. watch what happened. White developed his queen's knight, guarding his e4 pawn. A trade took place, white took it back, and now black attacked the white knight, knight to f6. Best for white at this point is to trade knights. But Reti designed the plan of castling queenside here, so he played queen to d3. Not the best move, but not a blunder either. Black overreacted. He thought that white, having violated a principle in developing his queen early, has left himself open for some kind of attack, so he played e5. White took the pawn, and black followed with a double attack, a fork, queen to a5 check, hitting the white king and the pawn at e5. White must be careful here. If he tries to block the check with his queen, also protecting the pawn, he gets pinned. Black can play bishop to b4, and that's it for the white queen, pinned to the king. Of course, white didn't do that in this case. He continued with his plan. Bishop d2, expediting queenside castling. Black took his pawn. It's all even again materially, but notice the white knight on e4 is pinned to the king. It can't move. And it's attacked twice. How should white protect it? Not at all, at least not directly. White castled. Here's the point that white had in mind. If queen takes e4, the black queen gets pinned to the king. No good. But still, there's knight takes e4. Why can't I do that? And Tartakover did do that. Queen d8 check, an incredible move, but setting up a double check. The king has no choice. It must be taken. And now here comes that double check, a discovered attack. Bishop to g5 check. Check from the rook and check from the bishop. So that even though two black pieces attack the bishop, the queen and knight, neither one can take the bishop because there's a secondary check from the rook. Where can the black king go? He can go to e8 or c7. If he goes to e8, that's mate, a bishop and rook mate. And c7, we have a diagonal mirror image of that mate. We have bishop to d8. So here was a case where black overreacted, thinking that white had violated the principle, I have to punish him. But black in turn wasn't ready for such operations. He wasn't developed really either. Now, one more example of castling and its ramifications. e4, e5, f4 takes, knight f3. And let's say black doesn't defend the pawn, as we saw in the previous King's Gambit example, but gives one back for development. Let's say he plays d5. White takes it. Of course, black's not going to play queen takes d5, subjecting his queen to additional attack. He instead plays knight to f6. White plays bishop to b5 check. Black plays c6. White exchanges. And let's say black takes it back, developing another piece to the center. Now, it's time for white to castle, but not quite time. That is, should you castle here? There's a problem with it. Black has queen to b6 check, hitting the king and the bishop, and you're going to drop a piece. White had to play d4 first before castling. So just because you can, and just because you're not walking into a mating attack, doesn't mean you should automatically castle. Once again, when you start to attack, make sure your king's position is safe and that you're really ready for operations. If you begin your attack too soon, you're going to fall victim to a powerful counterattack. I'd like to look at one final game that congeals those two important principles, playing for the center and developing the forces. The game was played in 1970 between Boris Spassky, then world champion from the Soviet Union, versus Bent Larsen from Denmark, a great player. and it was played in the USSR versus the rest of the world match. Larsen had white and began, curiously enough, with Larsen's opening, b3. He's going to post his bishop on the flank and direct it to the center. e5. Spassky assumes the center of the board. Bishop b2, attacking that pawn, and Spassky defended it with the nice development, knight to c6. c4, maintaining the policy of attacking the center without actually occupying it. Knight f6, and now knight to f3 attacks the e-pawn. Again, notice here that white still has not occupied the center of the board, but he's attacking that zone. e4, gaining time and space. The knight on f3 must move again. It did so to d4. Of course, black's not going to take it. Rather, he'll develop a piece with a threat. He plays bishop to c5. Black has 3 minor pieces out, white only 2, and black has 1 advanced pawn in the center, which is constraining the white position. Knight takes c6, saving his knight, the 3rd time that knight has moved. Now, how do you take it back? Toward the center, or as in this case, to facilitate development away from the center? I guess I tipped my hand there. D takes c6, opening the d file and giving black an enormous edge in space. Now, in fear of the attack against f2, white played e3 to break the bishop's diagonal. Black continued with his developing trend, bishop to f5. Notice all 4 black minor pieces have been moved. White still has out only 1. Rather than develop his game in a more useful way, he played queen to c2, a very stodgy move, and I don't think called for here. Black played queen to e7, overprotecting e4, and preparing the possibility of castling queenside. Bishop to e2. Finally, we get another minor piece out, and black did castle queenside, which not only gets the king to safety, it activates the rook and puts it on an open file, a half-open file, leading to the d-pawn. But notice all the squares guarded by that rook. Tremendous spatial edge for black. Now, simply because black can't take the f-pawn off en passant, because if he were to do so, white would have this move with check, is not justification for playing f4, because it weakens this line leading to the king. Now, black immediately capitalized on this weakness by playing knight to g4. That unveils the black queen's attack to h4. White would now like to drive away that knight sitting in the heart of his position. He'd like to play h3, but of course that would be too weakening and it would be a losing move because black would give check. In order to stop that check, white now made another unambitious pawn move, g3. That stops the queen check so that he can follow up with h3. But it didn't stop black altogether. He had h5. He's going to open up the h file so that his rooks can enter into the heart of the white position. h3, go away. Ignored. h4, take my knight. What I want is an open line leading to your game. Took the knight, winning a knight. H takes g3, and now we have a rook face-off. Of course, if white's rook on h1 takes the black rook on h8, we get a situation like this, and there's really no way that the white king side can be defended against that incursion. White has no pieces over there. His king will be subject to a winning attack. So instead of that exchange, black moved his rook, or rather white moved his rook, rook to g1. Now how are the black pieces going to come into the game without wasting any time? The answer was a cataclysmic rook sacrifice, which overturned white's position. He played rook to h1. No way you could turn that one down. The whole point of it is that black gains one tempo. He can play g2, threatening to make a queen, opening the line, and menacing white on the back rank. What's he to do? You might consider rook to g1, but that would lead to queen to h4 check. Way to go. One move. King to d1, and then using the pawn as an anchor, queen to h1. And there's really no answer to that. This position is going to fall apart. So rather than walk into that, that is, rather than allow this queen invasion here, White simply gave up his rook right away. He played rook to f1, said, take it, at least my rook is close to the queen, to the king, and it's defended, and I have a better chance of organizing some kind of reasonable protection for my king. Queen check. We still didn't take that rook. Boris Spassky is famous for things like that. Of course, you can't put the rook in the way at f2 because we sneak in and make a new queen, and that would be the end of this little theater. So he has to play king to d1, and after g takes f1 check, making a new queen, White resigned. There's really no adequate answer to that. You have to take the queen, and then bishop captures on g4 check, and you either block the check, allowing checkmate at h1, nowhere for the king to go, or you do flee after this check and don't block. You go king to c1, but this intrusion, queen to e1 check, gets the full point because you have to block with the white queen, and black then takes it off with his own queen, protected by the bishop, and that is checkmate. Incredible game, extraordinarily beautiful game. All the black pieces were used. Look, White's rook is still here, White's knight is still here. We won't even talk about his king, we shouldn't. The white king's bishop is back where it started. Of course White lost. He fell significantly behind in development. He lost the initiative. He was blown out. In your own games, play for the center of the board. Try to occupy the center, guard the central region, and influence it in any way you can. Develop all your pieces as soon as you can toward the center in a coherent, cohesive way. Get out those minor pieces. Castle, or at least prepare to castle early in the game, and then do so. Get the rooks to the central files and back up the advances of your central pawns. Don't waste time. Don't go pawn grabbing. Don't give pointless checks. Now go out there and conquer the world.